Captain Sarah Martinez felt the morning sun warm her face as she walked across the military airfield. Her flight suit was perfectly pressed, her boots polished to a mirror shine. Today was supposed to be a routine escort mission, but something in the air felt different. The wind carried an unusual tension that made experienced pilots like her pay attention. Sarah had been flying for 12 years, ever since she graduated from the Air Force Academy. She was one of only a few female fighter pilots in her squadron, and she had earned every bit of respect through skill and determination. Her colleagues no longer saw her as the woman who didn't belong. They saw her as Martinez, the pilot who could thread a needle with a fighter jet. The briefing room buzzed with quiet conversation as pilots reviewed their mission details. General Robert Hayes, a decorated war hero with silver hair and sharp eyes, stood at the front explaining the day's objectives. He would be flying in a transport aircraft to visit troops stationed near the border. Sarah and 3 other pilots would provide air cover in their F-16 Fighting Falcons. Intelligence reports suggest possible enemy activity in the area, General Hayes explained, pointing to a map on the wall. We're not expecting trouble, but we need to be ready for anything. Martinez, you'll take the lead position. Johnson, Williams, and Chen will form the defensive perimeter. Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had flown protective missions before, but escorting a general always carried extra pressure. One mistake could cost not just her own life, but the life of a man who had served his country for over 30 years. After the briefing, Sarah performed her pre-flight check with meticulous care. She ran her hands along the aircraft's surfaces, checking for any signs of damage or wear. The ground crew watched respectfully. They knew Martinez never rushed through safety procedures. Her thoroughness had saved lives more than once. Looking good today, Captain, Sergeant Rodriguez called out from beneath the aircraft. He had been maintaining Sarah's plane for 3 years and took pride in keeping it in perfect condition. She's ready to fly. Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began her startup sequence. The familiar sounds and vibrations of the powerful jet engine coming to life always gave her a sense of excitement mixed with calm focus. This was where she belonged, where everything made sense. In the air, there were no politics, no questioning of her abilities, just skill, instinct, and the laws of physics. The 4 fighters took off in formation, their engines roaring as they climbed into the clear blue sky. General Hayes followed in his transport plane, a larger, slower aircraft that would need their protection if trouble arose. The flight plan would take them over mountainous terrain, then across open valleys before reaching their destination. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. Sarah maintained radio contact with her wingman while scanning the horizon for any signs of hostile aircraft. The landscape below looked peaceful, small towns connected by winding roads, farms with geometric patterns of crops, and forests that stretched to the horizon. "Lead, this is Control," came a voice through her headset. "We're picking up unidentified aircraft approaching from the northeast. Multiple contacts heading your way fast." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She switched to tactical frequency and alerted her team. "All aircraft, we have bogies inbound. Stay tight and follow my lead. General, you need to change course and get to safety." But before the transport plane could alter its path, 6 enemy fighters appeared on the horizon like dark spots against the sky. They were moving with the deadly precision of experienced combat pilots, positioning themselves to attack from multiple angles. "This is Martinez to all units," Sarah broadcast over the radio. "Engage only on my command. Protect the transport at all costs." The enemy fighters split into 2 groups, clearly executing a planned attack. 3 moved to intercept the transport plane while the other 3 engaged Sarah's escort formation. The sky suddenly filled with the deadly dance of aerial combat. Sarah pushed her F-16 into a steep climb, trying to gain altitude advantage over the approaching enemies. Her wingmen followed, their aircraft carving sharp turns through the thin mountain air. The enemy pilots were skilled, but Sarah had something they didn't expect: years of experience flying in these exact mountains, knowing every wind current and weather pattern. The first missile launched from an enemy aircraft, streaking toward Johnson's plane with a trail of white smoke. "Break left, Johnson," Sarah shouted into her radio, while simultaneously launching her own missile at the attacker. The air battle became a chaotic mix of radio calls, engine noise, and the sharp crack of aircraft breaking the sound barrier. Sarah's missile found its target, sending one enemy fighter spiraling toward the ground in flames. But more enemies were closing in on the vulnerable transport plane. "General Hayes, you need to get out of here now," Sarah called to the transport, but it was too late. Two enemy fighters had positioned themselves perfectly, and their missiles struck the transport plane's engines. Sarah watched in horror as General Hayes's aircraft began losing altitude, black smoke pouring from both engines. The pilot was fighting to keep the plane airborne, but physics was working against him. "Mayday, mayday," came the general's calm voice over the radio. "We're going down. Engines are gone. Looking for a place to set her down." Sarah dove toward the damaged transport, trying to provide cover as it descended. Enemy fighters swarmed around her, but she managed to shoot down another one with precise cannon fire. Her fuel was getting low, and she could see that Williams and Chen were also running out of ammunition. The transport plane made a hard landing in a valley between two mountains, kicking up a cloud of dust and debris. Sarah could see it had landed relatively intact, but smoke was rising from the wreckage. She hoped General Hayes and his crew had survived the crash. "Martinez, we've got more enemies incoming," Johnson reported. "I count 8 additional aircraft approaching from the west." Sarah's heart sank. They were outnumbered and running low on fuel and weapons. The smart tactical decision would be to retreat and call for backup, but leaving General Hayes in enemy territory was not an option she could accept. As the new wave of enemy fighters approached, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She would have to do something no pilot manual had ever taught her. The 8 new enemy fighters approached like a wall of death, their formation tight and professional. Sarah's fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels, and she had only 2 missiles left. Johnson, Williams, and Chen were in similar situations. They had maybe 10 minutes of fighting time before they would be forced to retreat or face running out of fuel entirely. "Control, this is Martinez," Sarah called into her radio. "We need immediate backup. General Hayes is down in grid reference 7-4 Alpha. We're heavily outnumbered and low on fuel." "Martinez, backup is 40 minutes out," came the reply. "You need to disengage and return to base immediately. That's a direct order." Sarah looked down at the smoking wreckage in the valley below. She could see figures moving around the crashed transport plane. Some appeared to be General Hayes and his crew, but others looked like enemy ground forces who had arrived quickly to capture them. Time was running out. "Johnson, Williams, Chen," Sarah called to her remaining wingmen. "You heard control. Head back to base and guide the backup to our position. I'm staying to provide cover for the general." "Martinez, that's suicide," Johnson responded. "You can't take on 8 fighters alone." "I'm not planning to fight them," Sarah replied, her mind racing through possibilities. "I'm going to create enough confusion to buy time for backup to arrive. Get out of here. That's an order." Her 3 wingmen reluctantly broke formation and headed back toward their base. Sarah watched them disappear into the distance, then turned her attention back to the approaching enemy formation. She had perhaps 5 minutes before they would be in missile range. Sarah dove her F-16 toward the valley floor, using the mountainous terrain to break enemy radar locks. The landscape rushed past her canopy in a blur of rocks and trees. She had flown these mountains so many times that she knew every peak and valley by memory. The enemy fighters followed her down, but they were unfamiliar with the local terrain. Sarah used this advantage, threading her aircraft through narrow mountain passes where larger formations couldn't follow effectively. She forced them to break apart, turning their coordinated attack into a chaotic chase through dangerous terrain. 1. Enemy pilot tried to follow Sarah through a particularly narrow canyon, but misjudged the clearance needed for the rocky walls. His wing clipped a stone outcropping, sending his aircraft into an uncontrolled spin that ended in a massive explosion against the canyon floor. Sarah emerged from the canyon to find 3 enemy fighters waiting for her, positioned perfectly to attack. Missiles streaked toward her aircraft, and she threw her F-16 into a violent series of turns and climbs that pushed the aircraft to its limits. The G-forces pressed her deep into her seat, making it difficult to breathe, but her training kept her focused. She managed to avoid the first salvo of missiles, but more enemies were closing in from different angles. Sarah realized she was running out of options. Her fuel was critically low. She had used one of her 2 remaining missiles to destroy another enemy fighter, and the rest were positioning themselves for a coordinated attack that would be impossible to escape. That's when she saw her opportunity. The enemy fighters had focused so intently on her that they had moved away from the crash site where General Hayes was being held. Sarah made a split-second decision that went against every rule of aerial combat. She turned her F-16 directly toward the largest concentration of enemy aircraft and accelerated to maximum speed. The enemy pilots, thinking she was making a desperate attack run, positioned themselves to shoot her down. But at the last possible second, Sarah ejected from her aircraft. The pilotless F-16 continued its high-speed trajectory directly into the middle of the enemy formation. The resulting explosion when it collided with 2 enemy fighters created a massive fireball that scattered the remaining aircraft and bought precious seconds of confusion. Sarah descended toward the valley floor, under her parachute, watching as her burning fighter jet fell toward the mountains below. She had just sacrificed her aircraft, her career, possibly her life. But she had disrupted the enemy formation and given herself a chance to reach General Hayes on the ground. The parachute landing was rougher than she had hoped. Sarah hit the rocky valley floor hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Her left shoulder screamed with pain, probably dislocated, but she forced herself to her feet and quickly gathered her parachute to prevent it from giving away her position. The crash site was about 2 miles away across difficult terrain. Sarah could see smoke rising from the wreckage, and she could hear the distant sound of vehicles and voices. Enemy ground forces had definitely reached the general first. Sarah checked her survival equipment: a sidearm with 3 full magazines, a combat knife, a basic first aid kit, emergency food and water, and a radio that she hoped was still working. It wasn't much for what she was about to attempt, but it would have to be enough. Moving carefully through the rocky landscape, Sarah made her way toward the crash site. Her shoulder throbbed with every movement, but she forced herself to ignore the pain. General Hayes was depending on her, and she wouldn't let him down. As she got closer, she could see the situation more clearly. The transport plane had made a relatively good crash landing, but it was surrounded by enemy soldiers. She counted at least 15 hostiles, along with 3 military vehicles. General Hayes and 2 of his crew members were sitting on the ground, with their hands behind their heads, clearly prisoners. Sarah found a position on a rocky outcrop about 300 yards from the crash site, where she could observe without being seen. Through her small binoculars, she watched the enemy soldiers setting up what appeared to be a temporary command post. They were clearly planning to move the prisoners, probably to extract them to enemy territory for interrogation. The enemy commander was talking into a radio, probably reporting the successful capture to his superiors. Sarah could see that time was running out. If backup didn't arrive soon, General Hayes would be taken somewhere she couldn't follow. Sarah activated her emergency radio and whispered into it. "Control. This is Martinez. I'm on the ground at the crash site. General Hayes is alive but captured by approximately 15 enemy soldiers. They appear to be preparing to move him. Where is my backup?" "Martinez, backup is still 25 minutes out. Can you maintain visual contact and report enemy movements?" 25 minutes might as well have been 25 hours. Sarah could see the enemy soldiers loading equipment into their vehicles. They were preparing to leave, and once they moved General Hayes to a secure location, any rescue attempt would become nearly impossible. Sarah made another decision that her training had never covered. She was going to attempt a rescue mission alone, against overwhelming odds, with only her sidearm and whatever tactical advantages she could create. The smart move would be to wait for backup, but smart moves don't always save lives. Sarah studied the enemy camp with the methodical precision that had made her an exceptional pilot. Every successful mission began with understanding the situation completely. She counted 15 soldiers, 3 vehicles, and what appeared to be a portable communications unit. The prisoners, General Hayes and 2 crew members, were sitting near the largest vehicle under guard. The terrain worked in her favor. The crash site was in a natural depression surrounded by rocky hills and scattered boulders. The enemy had positioned themselves well for defense against an air attack, but they hadn't expected a ground assault from a single person. Sarah's shoulder continued to throb, but she forced herself to ignore it. She had about 20 minutes before backup arrived, but the enemy soldiers were clearly preparing to move. Their commander kept checking his watch and barking orders to his men. Moving carefully from rock to rock, Sarah began working her way closer to the camp. Her survival training had taught her how to move silently across different types of terrain. But theoretical knowledge was different from real-world application, with 15 armed enemies just a few hundred yards away. She reached a position about 150 yards from the camp where she could hear voices and see individual faces. General Hayes looked injured but alert. One of his crew members appeared to be unconscious, while the other was helping tend to his wounds. The enemy soldiers were professional but not overly cautious. They clearly didn't expect any immediate threat. Sarah's plan was necessarily simple, because complex plans rarely survived contact with reality. She would create a distraction that would draw most of the soldiers away from the prisoners, then move quickly to neutralize the remaining guards and extract General Hayes. It sounded almost impossible when she thought about it, but sometimes impossible was the only option available. The first step was eliminating their communications. Sarah could see the radio operator sitting near the communication equipment, occasionally speaking into his handset. If she could disable their ability to call for reinforcements, it would significantly improve her chances of success. Sarah removed a small explosive charge from her survival kit, standard equipment designed to destroy sensitive materials if a pilot was captured. She had never imagined using it offensively, but desperate situations called for creative solutions. Moving like a shadow between the rocks, Sarah worked her way around to the backside of the camp where the communication equipment was positioned. The radio operator was facing away from her, focused on his equipment and occasionally glancing toward the prisoners. Sarah waited for a moment when the soldier was completely absorbed in adjusting his radio, then moved swiftly across the open ground. She attached the small charge to the communication equipment and activated the timer. She would have exactly 3 minutes before it exploded. The return trip to her concealed position took longer because she had to move even more carefully. Discovery now would ruin everything and probably get General Hayes killed. Sarah reached safety with about 30 seconds to spare before the charge detonated. The explosion wasn't large, but in the quiet mountain valley it sounded like thunder. The communication equipment disintegrated in a shower of sparks and smoke, and the radio operator was thrown backward by the blast. Immediately, 8 soldiers ran toward the explosion site to investigate, leaving only 7 to guard the prisoners. Sarah had counted on this reaction, but 7 guards were still too many for a direct assault. She needed to reduce the numbers further. Moving to a new position that gave her a clear view of the remaining soldiers, she aimed her sidearm at the fuel tank of the nearest vehicle. The shot echoed across the valley, and the fuel tank erupted in flames. The burning vehicle created panic. Among the remaining guards and 3 more soldiers ran to deal with the fire, leaving only 4 men directly guarding the prisoners. Now Sarah faced the most dangerous part of her improvised plan. She had to cross about 50 yards of open ground to reach the prisoners, neutralize 4 armed soldiers, and extract General Hayes before the other soldiers realized what was happening. Sarah sprinted from her concealed position, using the smoke from the burning vehicle as cover. The first guard didn't see her until she was within 10 feet, and by then it was too late. Sarah's combat training took over, and she moved with lethal efficiency. The second guard turned at the sound of the struggle, but Sarah was already moving toward him. General Hayes, recognizing what was happening, suddenly stood up and tackled the third guard, giving Sarah the opportunity to deal with the fourth. "General, can you move?" Sarah asked quickly, while gathering weapons from the neutralized guards. "My leg is injured, but I can walk," General Hayes replied. "Captain Martinez, what the hell are you doing here? Where's your aircraft?" "Long story, sir. We need to move now before the others realize what's happening." Sarah helped the conscious crew member support General Hayes while checking on the unconscious man. He was alive but had a serious head injury that made moving him dangerous. Sarah made the hardest decision of her military career. They would have to leave him behind and send the rescue team back for him. The 3 of them began moving toward the rocky hills, but they had only covered about 100 yards when shouts, erupted from the enemy camp. The remaining soldiers had discovered their missing comrades and realized the prisoners had escaped. "There!" one soldier shouted in accented English. "3 people moving toward the hills." Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets striking the rocks around their position. Sarah pushed General Hayes and the crew member toward better cover while returning fire with one of the captured weapons. "Sir, we need to reach that ridgeline." Sarah pointed to a rocky outcrop about 300 yards away. "Once we get there, we'll have better defensive positions until backup arrives." "Martinez, you should have left me," General Hayes said as they moved from rock to rock. "This is too dangerous." "With respect, sir, that was never an option. The enemy soldiers were pursuing them systematically, using fire and movement tactics to advance while maintaining pressure." Sarah realized they were well-trained professionals, not the undisciplined fighters she had hoped to face. Bullets whined off the rocks around them as they climbed toward the ridge. The injured crew member was slowing them down, but Sarah refused to consider leaving anyone else behind. They had to reach defensive positions before the enemy could surround them. Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Martinez, this is Rescue 1. We're 5 minutes out. Can you signal your position?" "Rescue 1, we're on the north ridge of the crash site valley," Sarah replied between bursts of covering fire. "Be advised, we have active enemy contact. Approximately 10 hostiles pursuing us up the hillside." "Copy that, Martinez. Hold your position. We're coming in fast." But 5 minutes might be too long. The enemy soldiers were gaining ground and Sarah's ammunition was running low. She had started this day as a pilot on a routine mission, and now she found herself in a ground combat situation she had never trained for, responsible for the life of a general and facing overwhelming odds. As bullets continued to strike around their position, Sarah realized the hardest part of this impossible day was still ahead of them. The rocky ridge offered some protection, but Sarah could see enemy soldiers moving to flank their position from both sides. They were being systematically surrounded by professional soldiers who clearly had experience in mountain warfare. The crew member, Sergeant Davis, was weakening from blood loss, and General Hayes's injured leg was making movement increasingly difficult. Sarah assessed their defensive position with the same analytical mind she used for aerial combat. They had good cover from direct fire but limited ammunition and no escape route. The enemy would eventually work their way close enough to overwhelm their position through sheer numbers. "Martinez, how many rounds do you have left?" General Hayes asked, wincing as he adjusted his position behind a large boulder. "Maybe 30 rounds between both weapons," Sarah replied honestly. "Sergeant Davis, how are you holding up?" "I'm okay." "Captain?" Davis lied unconvincingly. The bandage Sarah had applied to his shoulder wound was already soaked with blood, and his face was pale with shock. Sarah's radio crackled again. "Martinez, this is Rescue 1. We can see smoke from your position, but we're taking ground fire from the valley. We need to clear the landing zone before we can extract you." Sarah watched through her binoculars as 2 military helicopters approached the valley. Enemy soldiers immediately began firing at the aircraft with automatic weapons. The rescue helicopters returned fire with their door gunners, but they couldn't land safely while under attack. "Rescue 1, the enemy has us pinned on the north ridge," Sarah transmitted. "If you can suppress the soldiers in the valley, we can make it to a better landing zone." "Copy that. Stand by for gun run." The lead helicopter dove toward the valley floor, its machine guns chattering as it strafed the enemy positions around the crash site. The second helicopter circled to provide covering fire. Sarah watched enemy soldiers scramble for cover as the helicopters pressed their attack. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. While the enemy soldiers in the valley were focused on the helicopters, the ones pursuing Sarah's group had momentarily taken cover from the aerial assault. "Sir, we need to move now," Sarah told General Hayes. "There's a clearing about 200 yards down the backside of this ridge where the helicopters can pick us up." General Hayes nodded grimly. "Davis, can you make it?" "Yes, sir," the sergeant replied, though his voice was weak. Sarah helped both men to their feet, and they began moving carefully down the steep backside of the ridge. The terrain was treacherous, covered with loose rocks and hidden crevices that could easily break an ankle. Sarah had to balance speed with safety, They needed to reach the landing zone quickly, but an injury now would doom them all. Behind them, she could hear enemy soldiers shouting to each other as they realized their quarry was escaping. Gunfire erupted again, but the bullets were going wide because the shooters couldn't get clear shots through the rocky terrain. "There's the clearing." Sarah pointed to a relatively flat area surrounded by pine trees. It was large enough for a helicopter to land, but just barely. "Rescue 1, we're approaching the landing zone on the backside of the ridge. Can you reach us there?" "Affirmative, Martinez. We're breaking off the gun run now. ETA, to your position. 90 seconds. But 90 seconds was a long time when enemy soldiers were pursuing them down a mountainside. Sarah could hear voices getting closer, and occasionally she caught glimpses of armed figures moving through the trees above them. They reached the clearing just as the first helicopter came into view, flying low between the mountain peaks. The powerful rotor wash sent dust and debris swirling through the air as the aircraft prepared to land. "Contact rear," Davis suddenly shouted, raising his weapon toward the tree line. Enemy soldiers were emerging from the forest, taking positions to fire on the landing helicopter. Sarah pushed General Hayes toward the approaching aircraft while returning fire with her remaining ammunition. The helicopter door gunner was also firing, but the enemy soldiers had good cover among the trees. "Go, go, go!" Sarah shouted over the noise of the helicopter engines. She helped General Hayes into the aircraft, then turned to assist Sergeant Davis, who had been hit again and was stumbling toward the helicopter. Bullets struck the ground around the landing zone as more enemy soldiers appeared. The helicopter pilot was shouting over the intercom, "We need to go now, we're taking too much fire." Sarah got Davis into the helicopter, then turned to provide covering fire while the aircraft lifted off. But as she moved toward the helicopter door, a burst of automatic weapon fire caught her in the leg, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground. "Martinez is hit," she heard someone shout over the radio. The helicopter was already lifting off, carrying General Hayes and Davis to safety, but Sarah was still on the ground in the landing zone. "We're coming back for you," came the pilot's voice through her radio. "Find cover and hold on." But Sarah could see that enemy soldiers were already surrounding the clearing. The helicopter couldn't return without flying into a trap. She dragged herself behind a fallen log, her leg bleeding heavily and largely useless. "Negative, Rescue 1, Sarah transmitted. "The LZ is compromised. Do not return. Get the general to safety. That's the primary mission." Sarah could hear enemy soldiers moving through the trees around the clearing, calling to each other as they closed in on her position. She had maybe 2 rounds left in her weapon, and her leg wound was bleeding too heavily for her to attempt another escape through the mountains. For a moment, Sarah felt a wave of despair. She had succeeded in rescuing General Hayes, but now she was going to be captured or killed by enemy forces. All her training, all her years of dedicated service would end in this remote mountain clearing. Then she heard something that changed everything. In the distance, growing rapidly louder, was the distinctive sound of jet engines, multiple aircraft flying fast and low. Sarah activated her emergency beacon and waited. The sound grew to a roar as 4 F-16 Fighting Falcons screamed over the mountain peaks led by Johnson, Williams, and Chen, her wingmen who had returned with reinforcements. The jets dove toward the valley, their weapon systems locked onto enemy positions. "Martinez, this is Johnson. We see your beacon. Keep your head down. We're clearing the area." The mountain valley erupted in explosions as the F-16s delivered precision strikes on enemy positions. Trees splintered and rocks flew as guided. Missiles found their targets. The enemy soldiers who had been closing in on Sarah's position were suddenly fighting for their own survival. "Rescue 2 is inbound to your position," came a new voice over Sarah's radio. "We'll have you out of there in 2 minutes." Sarah smiled despite her pain as she heard the approaching helicopter. Sometimes the cavalry really did arrive just in time. She had started this day as a pilot on a routine mission, lost her aircraft, rescued a general from enemy captivity, and now she was about to be rescued herself. But as the second helicopter approached her position, Sarah realized her extraordinary day was far from over. Enemy reinforcements were approaching from the east, and the battle for this remote mountain valley was just beginning. The rescue helicopter descended through the smoke and chaos, its crew chief rappelling down to reach Sarah's position behind the fallen log. Explosions continued to echo through the valley as the F-16s maintained their attack on enemy positions, but Sarah could see new threats emerging from the eastern approaches. "Captain Martinez, I'm Corporal Jackson," the crew chief shouted over the noise. "We're getting you out of here." Jackson quickly assessed Sarah's leg wound and applied a pressure bandage to slow the bleeding. The injury was serious but not immediately life-threatening if they could get her to medical attention quickly. Sarah gritted her teeth as Jackson prepared to move her to the helicopter. "Contact east," the helicopter door gunner suddenly called out. Multiple vehicles approaching fast. Through the swirling dust, Sarah could see a convoy of enemy military vehicles racing across the valley, floor toward their position. The vehicles were equipped with anti-aircraft weapons that posed a serious threat to the rescue helicopter. "Rescue 2, you need to abort," Sarah told the pilot over her radio. "Don't risk the helicopter for one person." "Negative, Captain. We're not leaving anyone behind." But the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The F-16s had neutralized the immediate threat from infantry soldiers, but they couldn't engage the approaching vehicles without risking the rescue helicopter with their explosions. Jackson quickly secured Sarah in a rescue harness and signaled to the helicopter crew. "We need to go now," he shouted. The helicopter lifted off just as the first enemy vehicle crested a ridge and opened fire with its mounted machine gun. Tracer rounds streaked past the aircraft as the pilot threw it into evasive maneuvers, flying low between the mountain peaks to avoid the anti-aircraft fire. "Johnson, this is Rescue 2, the helicopter pilot called to the F-16 formation. "We have Martinez, but we're taking heavy fire from ground vehicles. Can you suppress?" "Roger, Rescue 2. We're on it." Sarah watched through the helicopter's window as her fellow pilots dove their fighters toward the enemy convoy. The precision of their attack was beautiful and terrible. Missiles streaked from the F-16s to destroy vehicles in brilliant explosions that lit up the mountainside. But the enemy had learned from their earlier defeats. As the fighters pressed their attack, shoulder-fired missiles launched from concealed positions among the rocks. Sarah's heart stopped as she saw a missile streak toward Johnson's aircraft. "Johnson, brake left," Sarah shouted into her radio, though she knew he probably couldn't hear her transmission over the combat frequency chatter. Johnson saw the threat at the last second and threw his F-16 into a violent turn, but the missile detonated close enough to damage his aircraft. Sarah watched in horror as her wingman's fighter began trailing smoke and losing altitude. "Mayday, mayday," Johnson's voice came over the radio. "I'm hit and losing power, looking for a place to set it down." The rescue helicopter was now carrying Sarah away from the battle zone, but she couldn't take her eyes off the valley where her wingman was fighting to keep his damaged aircraft in the air. Johnson had flown back to help rescue her, and now he was in the same desperate situation she had faced hours earlier. "Turn us around," Sarah told the helicopter pilot. "Captain, you need medical attention immediately," Corporal Jackson protested. "We need to get you to the field hospital." "Negative, Johnson is going down and we can't leave him." The pilot hesitated. His orders were to extract Captain Martinez and return to base, but he could see the smoking F-16 struggling to maintain altitude in the distance. "Sir, Captain Martinez is right," the door gunner added. "If Johnson goes down in that valley, he'll be captured or killed before any other rescue team can reach him." The pilot made his decision. "All right, we're going back, but if this gets too hot, we're leaving immediately." The helicopter turned around and headed back toward the battle. Sarah could see Johnson's F-16 getting lower, the pilot clearly struggling with failing systems. The other F-16s were providing cover, but they were also running low on fuel and ammunition after their extended combat. "Johnson, what's your status?" Sarah called over the radio. "Martinez, is that you? I thought you were on your way to the hospital." "Change of plans. Where are you planning to set down?" "There's a flat area about 2 miles north of the original crash site." "But Martinez, this area is crawling with hostiles. Don't risk the rescue bird for me." Sarah studied the terrain through her binoculars. Johnson was right. The area where he would have to land was still contested territory, with enemy forces scattered throughout the mountains. A helicopter rescue would be extremely dangerous. But Sarah remembered sitting in the briefing room that morning, listening to General Hayes talk about the mission. The military didn't abandon its people, even when the odds were impossible. Rescue 2, can you reach Johnson's landing zone? Sarah asked. It's going to be tight and we'll be sitting ducks for any ground forces in the area, the pilot replied. Sarah made a decision that would have surprised her 12 hours earlier. Then we make it fast. Get in, grab Johnson, and get out before anyone can react. The helicopter raced across the mountainous terrain toward Johnson's crash site. Sarah could see the damaged F-16 descending rapidly, its pilot fighting to reach the small clearing he had identified. Smoke trailed behind the aircraft as it approached the valley floor. Johnson managed to land his fighter relatively intact, though it immediately burst into flames as the damaged fuel system ignited. Sarah watched her wingman emerge from the cockpit and run clear of the burning aircraft, apparently uninjured. Johnson's on the ground and mobile, the door gunner reported. But I'm seeing movement in the trees around the landing zone. Enemy soldiers were converging on Johnson's position from multiple directions. The pilot had perhaps 2 minutes before he would be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Take us in fast, Sarah ordered. We get Johnson and leave immediately. The helicopter dove toward the clearing where Johnson was waiting, its engines screaming as the pilot pushed the aircraft to its limits. Enemy soldiers opened fire from the tree line, but their shots were hasty and mostly inaccurate. Corporal Jackson was ready with another rescue harness as the helicopter flared for landing. Johnson sprinted toward the aircraft while bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. Sarah provided covering fire with a weapon Jackson had given her despite her wounded leg. Got him, Jackson shouted as he hauled Johnson into the helicopter. But as the helicopter lifted off, more enemy vehicles appeared on the valley floor. Anti-aircraft missiles streaked toward them, and the pilot had to perform desperate evasive maneuvers to avoid being shot down. The helicopter climbed desperately through the mountain passes, weaving between peaks as missiles exploded around them. Sarah gripped her harness tightly while watching tracer fire streak past the aircraft windows. Johnson was conscious but shaken from his crash landing, and both pilots knew they weren't safe until they cleared the contested airspace. Control, this is Rescue 2. The helicopter pilot transmitted. We have both Martinez and Johnson aboard, requesting fighter escort for return journey. Rescue 2. This is Williams, came the familiar voice of Sarah's remaining wingman. Chen and I are low on fuel, but we'll escort you as far as we can. Sarah looked out the helicopter window to see the 2 remaining F-16s take up protective positions on either side of the rescue aircraft. Williams and Chen had been flying combat missions for over 3 hours, far longer than normal operational limits, but they weren't abandoning their teammates. As they flew over the last mountain ridge before reaching friendly territory, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe they might actually make it home safely. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the day's impossible challenges was beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the throbbing pain in her wounded leg. Martinez, Johnson said, settling into the seat beside her. What you did back there, rescuing General Hayes alone, then coming back for me, that was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the craziest. Probably both, Sarah admitted with a weak smile. I never planned to spend my day as a ground soldier fighting enemy troops in the mountains. Corporal Jackson continued monitoring Sarah's medical condition while maintaining radio contact with the field hospital. Her leg wound needed immediate surgical attention, but she was stable enough for the flight back to base. Captain, the doctors are standing by for both of you, Jackson reported. General Hayes specifically requested updates on your condition. He's doing fine, by the way. You saved his life. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. When she woke up that morning, her biggest concern had been flying a routine escort mission. Now she had shot down enemy fighters, survived a crash, conducted a solo rescue operation, and helped extract her wingman from hostile territory. The helicopter touched down at the military medical facility just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Medical personnel immediately moved Sarah and Johnson to the emergency treatment area, where doctors began working to treat their injuries. General Hayes appeared in the treatment room despite his own injuries, walking with the aid of crutches. His leg was heavily bandaged, but his eyes were sharp and focused. Captain Martinez, he said formally, I wanted to personally thank you for what you did today. Your actions went far beyond the call of duty. Sir, I was just doing my job, Sarah replied, as doctors worked on her wounded leg. No, Captain. Your job was to provide air cover for my transport. Everything after that was pure courage and dedication. You saved my life and the lives of others at considerable risk to yourself. General Hayes turned to address the medical staff and other personnel who had gathered in the treatment area. I want everyone to understand what happened today. Captain Martinez shot down multiple enemy aircraft, survived the destruction of her own fighter, conducted a solo rescue operation against overwhelming odds, and then risked her life again to save her wingman. This is the kind of courage and commitment that makes our military the finest in the world. Over the following days, as Sarah recovered from surgery to repair her leg wound, the full scope of the day's events became clear. Intelligence reports revealed that the enemy had planned a coordinated attack specifically to capture General Hayes, knowing his strategic importance and the intelligence he possessed. The enemy had committed significant resources to the operation, including advanced fighter aircraft and specially trained ground forces. Sarah's improvised defense and rescue had disrupted their entire plan, preventing what could have been a major intelligence disaster. Johnson visited Sarah's hospital room. On the third day after the mission, walking with only a slight limp from his own crash injuries. The debriefing team wants to know how you planned that whole rescue operation, he said, settling into a chair beside her bed. Sarah laughed. That's the thing, I didn't plan any of it. I was making it up as I went along, trying to buy time, until backup arrived. Well, your improvisation saved a general's life and probably prevented an international incident. The intelligence people are saying General Hayes was carrying information that could have compromised ongoing operations across the entire theater. Sarah stared out the hospital window at the mountains in the distance. Somewhere out there was the valley where she had spent the most challenging day of her military career, where she had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed. Johnson, do you think we'll ever have another day like that? God, I hope not. Johnson replied, immediately. Though I have to admit, flying with you has never been boring. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the base commander's office, her dress uniform crisp and perfect despite the slight limp that would probably never completely disappear. General Hayes was there, along with senior officers from throughout the command structure. Captain Sarah Martinez, the base commander, read from an official document. For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy forces, you are hereby awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with Combat B device. The ceremony continued with additional commendations for her ground combat actions, her rescue of General Hayes, and her role in saving Johnson's life. Sarah stood at attention, thinking about how dramatically her life had changed in a single day. After the ceremony, General Hayes approached her privately. Captain, I have a question for you. Are you interested in a new assignment? We're forming a special operations unit that combines air and ground capabilities, given your proven abilities. In both areas, I think you'd be perfect for the program. Sarah considered the offer. She had always loved flying, but the events of that day had shown her that she was capable of much more than she had ever imagined. The military needed people who could adapt, improvise, and succeed when everything went wrong. Sir, when do I start? General Hayes smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Welcome to the most challenging assignment of your career, Captain Martinez. As Sarah left the ceremony, she looked up at the clear blue sky where F-16s were conducting training flights. She had started as a pilot who happened to be a woman, fighting to prove herself in a male-dominated field. Now she was simply Martinez, the officer who got impossible jobs done when everyone else said they couldn't be done. The mountains in the distance reminded her of that extraordinary day when everything had gone wrong, and somehow she had found a way to make it right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, and new opportunities to serve. Sarah Martinez was ready for all of them. 6 months later, stories about the female pilot who had rescued a general and fought her way out of enemy territory had become legend throughout the military. But for Sarah, it was just the beginning of a career that would take her places she had never imagined, doing things that no training manual had ever covered. Sometimes the most important missions were the ones nobody planned for, and sometimes the most extraordinary people were the ones who simply refused to give up when everything seemed impossible.